Friends, we're going to continue our discussion of David Hume today. Please pull out your copies of the inquiry, and we'll talk about some of the issues that are raised here. So if you recall from previous discussions in previous classes, David Hume favors skeptical philosophy, so he tends to doubt things. In this sense, he's like Descartes, but he's very much not like Descartes in another sense. Hume is an empiricist, and Descartes was a rationalist. I've mentioned this distinction before in class, but let me just revisit it here very quickly. As an empiricist, Hume thinks that human beings gain their knowledge from their senses. And in fact, he thinks that the mind is entirely formed by the senses. Nothing in our minds comes from any other source except the senses. This is the classic distinguishing doctrine of empiricism. Empiricism's great opponent as a philosophical theory is rationalism. And Descartes was a rationalist. Plato was a rationalist. The rationalists assert over and against the empiricists that humans in their minds have innate ideas. These innate ideas form the way they see the world. And they pre-exist experience and they shape our experience. The controversy between empiricism and rationalism takes place within a philosophical field known as epistemology. Epistemology is just the study of knowledge. And it's not the sort of a controversy that can be resolved in, just a few lectures or some short inquiry. It's a classic controversy. It is not the sort of thing that we can ever fully know because we can't get at the mind prior to its experiences of the world. The empiricist says everything in the mind is a result of a sensory experience. The rationalist says, no, the mind actively shapes its experiences with its own predetermined framework. But since we can never actually encounter minds without experiences, we can never determine which side is correct in this famous controversy. For our purposes, what we need to remember in understanding Hume is that Hume starts from the empirical assumption that the ideas that are present in the mind have as their origins the senses. And he thinks that this explains all of our ideas. It explains quite obviously the thoughts that we have that are of things that we see in the world: tables, chairs, buildings, people, cars, houses. But it also explains, he thinks, thoughts that we have of things that we do not see in the world, but that we can nevertheless think. Mermaids, unicorns, winged horses, other fictions are dreamed up by us. When we add things that we see in the world together, we conjoin them together and create other kinds of things that are fictional objects. Fish and people, mermaid. Bird and horse, Pegasus. Rhinoceros horn, horse body, unicorn, or whatever. And the point there for Hume is just that all of our ideas can ultimately be traceable to the senses. In thinking thoughts that don't reference direct sensory experiences, we are ultimately just putting sensory experiences together. Okay, this is on display especially, and I'm still just reviewing here, we haven't gotten to today's new materials. This is on display especially in section 2 of the inquiry, where he talks about the origin of our ideas. And there he says that ideas can be either the product of sensation, that is sensory experience, or they can be the product of imagination working in conjunction with sensation. Okay, the mind operating upon the senses, rearranging and interpreting the evidence of the senses. And according to Hume, in the second section of the inquiry, the origin of ideas section, the mind's interpretive faculty uses at least 4 mental operations to derive from sense impressions larger kinds of things. Okay, and these operations include compounding the sense impression, that is, adding one idea to another, okay, or transposing the sense impression, that is, substituting one part of a sensory impression for another. Okay, they include augmenting the sensory impression, so you take the size of a normal human and you augment it and you create in your mind an image of a giant who doesn't actually exist in the world, but who you think as a thought because you have augmented really existing sensory experience. And finally, they include diminishing. Okay, just as you can imagine a giant, so also you can imagine something very small. A famous book from Hume's century was Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, an 18th century text where an Englishman travels to a land called Lilliput, and in Lilliput the people are really, really, really small. Full-grown people are only this large. It was a satirical work intended to make some satirical commentaries on some of the issues in European society at the time, but I think we kind of get the point about how we can either augment or diminish things that are really in the world. Okay, Hume does deal in section 2 with the big objection, and it's called the missing shade of blue objection. And I don't have a bunch of colors up here that I can show you guys. But the reality is that human beings have not seen all the different colors of the spectrum. There are always colors of the spectrum that we haven't seen yet. So imagine that this is dark blue over here, and we get lighter and lighter and lighter. And here is light blue, very, very, very light blue, to the lightest shade of blue. And Hume says that he could imagine a missing shade of blue in the middle there that we actually have not seen yet. Okay, a man who has experienced every shade of blue but one, for instance. Hume does think that a man who has experienced every shade of blue but one will be able to ascertain what this particular shade of blue should look like, even though he has never experienced it. Okay, although this seems initially to pose a problem for the empirical view that Hume says, where he asserts that all of our ideas ultimately come from our sensory experiences, still, Hume considers it to be an idea that can be derived from surrounding ideas. And so in that sense, it can be traceable to our sensory experiences. Combinations of previous sensory impressions is the way to think about this here. Okay, now that's good for a review for us. A lot of the inquiry is an investigation into very subtle operations of the mind. Hume is trying to figure out how the mind operates and when it does operate a particular way, why it does so. I want to talk now a little bit more in a little bit more depth about section 4, his skeptical doubts section. Okay, so I'll be reading bits and pieces from this section. Okay, and I hope that everyone has seen the lectures from last week discussing Hume, yes? Okay, have we encountered Hume's fork from the lectures? Hume's fork is a famous distinction. For our purposes here, let me just review. Check out the videos from last week if you haven't encountered this distinction yet. Okay, on page 15 in my text, section 4, beginning of the section, I'll open up the text if you have it with you. Hume writes, all the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into 2 kinds. Relations of ideas and matters of fact. Relations of ideas and matters of fact. And again, this is just a quick review here. relations of ideas are propositions that are necessarily true. They are true by definition. They have to be true. A relation of ideas is a proposition like 8 plus 8 equals 16, where all bachelors are unmarried persons. That's a relation of ideas. Kendrick?
Well, I thought that was a matter of fact, that it didn't need like an outside source.
No. It's precisely the opposite, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, a matter of fact needs an outside source to confirm its truth, whereas a relation of ideas is necessarily true by definition. Thank you. Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. So relations of ideas are propositions, sentences, assertions that are necessarily the case, whereas matters of fact, by contrast, are assertions like it is raining in Houston today, or LeBron James is very tall. These are the kinds of propositions that require some external reference in order to verify and determine the truth of. Okay, now, this is an important distinction, and Hume delves deeply in section 4 into the matters of fact idea. Okay, he says, matters of fact, which are the second objects of human reason, are not ascertained in the same way that relations of ideas are. Okay, and I'm going to turn the page here and look on page 16. He asserts, all reasonings concerning matter of fact seem to be founded on the relation of cause and effect. Okay, by means of that relation alone, we can go beyond the evidence of our memory and senses. And I'm going to read a couple more passages. I'm looking on page 17 in the first third of the page. I shall venture to affirm as a general proposition that the knowledge of the cause and effect relation is not in any instance attained by reasonings a priori. It arises entirely from experience, when we find that any particular objects are constantly conjoined with each other. Okay, this is a really important assertion. Very important, very influential. Okay, Hume is saying here that it is not possible to ascertain that one thing causes another, or that even one thing is related to another prior to experience. You have to have experience in order to determine that one thing is connected to another. Okay, so let me start illustrating this. We're actually getting into the second big point of the lecture. This is called the problem of induction. It's an age-old, very difficult philosophical problem, one that seems impossible to resolve. But let me describe a little bit what I mean by this. Hume's own example is to use the billiard ball table and to talk about the movement of the balls against each other. Okay, so back when I was a teenager, we used to play ping pong and pool. This was prior to everybody being on their smartphones. I'm sure you guys have played these games before. On a pool table, you have corner pockets, central pockets, and if you're playing standard 8-ball pool, here's a cue stick. The idea is to sink all of the strikes or the solids, depending on which you are, and then at the end of the game, we'll say this is the cue ball, you use the cue ball to strike an 8-ball, sending the 8-ball into a corner or side pocket in the hopes that you can win the game. All right, if you strike the 8-ball at this location in a particular spot, you can hit it into the corner pocket. Okay, now imagine that you are watching me play pool, and you watch me use that cue stick to strike the cue ball, and I ask you beforehand, assuming that this cue ball strikes the 8 ball after I hit the cue ball. Okay, I hit the cue ball strikes the 8 ball. What will happen to the 8 ball? Okay, now you don't necessarily have to predict the direction, just like what in general in terms of movement will happen to the 8 ball after the cue ball strikes the 8 ball. It's not real hard. Like what happens to an 8 ball after the cue ball strikes it? It moves, right? That's the answer. Okay, and suppose that I do strike the cue ball and the cue ball strikes the 8 ball and the 8 ball moves, and you were proved correct. But suppose that I then ask you, how did you know that it would move? How did you know that when the cue ball struck the 8 ball would move? What's the answer here? From experience is what Hume would say. Okay, as an empiricist, Hume would say the reason why you knew that the 8 ball would move is, as Riley says, from experience. Notice that Hume thinks it is not the case that you would know prior to experience that when the cue ball struck the 8 ball would move. As he says, let me read the line again. I shall venture to affirm as a general proposition that the knowledge of the cause-effect relation is not attained by reasonings a priori, that's Latin for prior to. It arises entirely from experience when we find that any particular objects are constantly conjoined with each other. Okay, so what Hume is arguing then is that if you were to take a mental virgin who has never seen one object strike another before and ask that person, when the cue ball strikes the 8 ball, will the 8 ball move? That person would not be able to answer definitively. That person could only guess. Okay, because it is only experience that teaches us that the 8 ball will move when the cue ball strikes it. Okay, experience has taught me, after many, many thousands of instances, that when I let go of objects, those objects fall to the ground or to the floor. I was reading a study of some researchers who took really little kids, 2-month-olds, 3-month-olds, and they'd put these kids in these, testing chambers, and they'd have secret wires that the kids couldn't see. And the kid would be playing with the ball and would, let go of the ball, and the ball would fly up instead of drop because of the wires that were holding it. And they do this with other objects too. And so the kid would initially be startled and then accept that. It's like, okay, that's the world I live in. And then they put the kids outside of these special chamber things. And the kids would see balls drop and the kids would be startled by that because that wasn't the world that they had expected. Okay. We come to believe that gravity will be a thing because of experience. Okay, I was also reading a study about a year ago about how they set up mirrors right here for, again, really little kids, like 2-month-old, 3-month-old kids, and they'd roll a ball off the end of the table. And usually, of course, it would drop. But because of the mirror, the kid couldn't see that there was actually another table here behind the mirror, and so the ball would roll off the table and appear to hover in midair. And the kid would be like, oh, and then accept it. Okay, that's the way the world is. But again, the kid comes to believe that comes to believe that gravity is a force by virtue of experience. Similarly, Riley is correct. The answer that you should give, according to Hume, is that the way you know the cue ball will strike the 8 ball, when the cue ball strikes the 8 ball will move, is because of experience. It is not, though, that you know that the 8 ball necessarily will move. It is not that it has to move. It is merely that you have seen it many, many times before. Okay, let me illustrate this with some inferences from experience that are quite clearly false. Okay, so here's an inference from experience. Lots of people have died. Whenever someone dies, it's not me. So I must not die. Lots of instances proving this, okay? But quite clearly a false inference. Okay, or how about this one? This is a very famous one. I'm just going to read this. This is an example not provided by Hume, but by one of his interpreters. Domestic animals expect food when they see the person who usually feeds them. The man who has fed the chicken every day throughout its life at last wrings its neck instead, showing that when the chicken believed that food would be coming, it had established views about the uniformity of nature that were false. Okay, let me illustrate this with some examples that we believe now to be correct necessarily. Okay, even though of course they're just shaped by experience. The sun rises in the east every morning. So tomorrow morning the sun must rise in the east. Okay, again, that has a different kind of feel to it because we believe it to be true, necessarily the case, than the observation that when someone dies, it's not me, so I must not be, die. I must not die. Because we have taken, Hume thinks, the experience of the sun always rising in the east, and we have augmented that to another level mentally and have come to believe that that is necessarily the case. So it's sort of like you can imagine two different conceptual levels. Okay, so here is the level of necessity. This is something that has to be the case. And here's a lower level of experience. Okay, and let's say every time the sun rises in the east, we'll say a grain of sand is added. And more grains of sand are added, more grains of sand are added, more grains of sand are added, more grains of sand. And eventually the pile gets really big, and we take the conceptual leap from experiences which are in the thousands now, and we assume necessity. But that's really actually a false inference. This is the problem of induction, is we have leaped from experience to necessity. We have leaped from to remember Hume's fork, we have leaped from a matter of fact to a relation of ideas. And we have asserted that because a matter of fact has always, in our past experience, been the case, it must always necessarily be the case. But this is not true, according to Hume. This is not true, necessarily. Okay? It is not necessarily true. To assert on the basis of experience, even experiences numbering in the thousands, that something is necessarily the case is to commit a logical fallacy. So the problem of induction, just to summarize it in a nutshell, is taking a number of observations about something and then presupposing that because those observations have always been a particular way, that something must be that way. Okay, that something has to be that way. And that's a fallacy. And this is a big problem at the heart of science. Because science is the accumulation of observations and a generalization about the way things are on the basis of that accumulation of observations. Kendrick.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to comment. Isn't that exactly what science says in the scientific design, to experiment over and over? But you said it.
Yeah, it absolutely is, right? So this is a stab right at the heart of science because at the center of the scientific project is the notion that based on past observations, we can generalize what we call laws, and these laws can apply to future instances. But the problem here, Hume would say, is that we are taking experiences, even many, many experiences, and generalizing from there to necessity. Okay, the chicken who thinks that every time when the master has come, he has brought food, is committing a logical fallacy when he thinks that the master will bring food tomorrow when in fact the master has come to wring his neck. Okay, it's a logical fallacy to leap to necessity from experience, is the notion in the problem of induction. Okay, let me illustrate it just a different way. I think I've mentioned this illustration before. If you imagine it in terms of circles, right? If this is all the zebras that I have seen, or that any of us have seen, and maybe there are a few zebras that we have not seen. So these are the zebras who have been observed, and all of these zebras have stripes. And if we then infer on that basis that zebras must necessarily have stripes, we are taking experiences and we are applying them to the whole of a population set, and we're doing so fallaciously because we have not seen these other zebras outside of the observed set. So we do not know whether those zebras have stripes or not. The problem of induction is that human beings are necessarily mentally limited. And as mentally limited beings, it is natural for us to take our experiences and to generalize on the basis of these experiences, often beyond the level to which we should be doing. Okay, Hume calls this the uniformity of nature problem. We think that nature is always and everywhere the same, because it sure has felt like that when we have observed it. But of course we don't know whether that is the case, and that is a logical fallacy to leap from experience to the next level of certainty, namely necessity. Yeah, Kendrick.
My question is, what exists on the plane of necessity?
Sure, 8 plus 8 equals 16. All the relations of ideas, all bachelors are unmarried. Those exist on the plane of necessity because they are for sure the case. But matters of fact don't have that kind of certainty. They are based on experience. And experience can only reference past instances. Okay? So your answer then should be, if I ask you, why will when the cue ball strikes the 8 ball, will the 8 ball move? Your answer should be, it's always done that before. Okay, according to Hume, your answer should be something based in experience. It's always done that before. And in a certain sense, then, scientists are actually historians, because scientists are not telling us things that always have to be the case necessarily. Rather, scientists are telling us things that have always in the past been the case, or to all observed efforts have been the case. Okay, various attempts have been made to resolve the problem of induction. Okay, let me just mention a couple of these attempts here. So one is to bite the bullet. Okay, so these are resolutions to the problem of induction. We'll call this the bite the bullet resolution. Okay, the bite the bullet resolution says, a world inaccessible to inductive procedures would just not be conceivable. Okay, so in practice, it's always best to assume that observations numbering in the thousands will bring about certain, or more or less certain. Okay? Because if we didn't do this, then we wouldn't be able to function in the world. This is the bite the bullet response. Okay, so we have to assume the homogeneity of the future vis-a-vis the past. That is, we have to assume that the future is going to be like the past, because if we didn't do that, then we wouldn't be able to function in the world. Okay, often you'll hear that the future resembles the past. Okay, really, there's nothing that ever exactly mirrors the past. But I will say this, having been around in life for a long time, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. It often rhymes. And by that I mean that when you look at future human events, they often resemble, in some sense, past events. And in the case of scientific observations, the bite-the-bullet response says we have to assume that the future will be like the past or else we can't function as human beings. Okay, there's another response. This response is based on statistics. Okay, so we might call this the statistical accumulation response or the statistical summary response. And this response says your certainty in something can increase in accordance with the number of observations of it that you have. So if you don't have a whole lot of observations of something, then you shouldn't predicate certain things about it. But if you've seen something happen 1,000 times, then you can be much more confident in it happening in the future in the same way than if you have not. Okay, so this is kind of analogous to trying to suppose that you've got a barrel full of balls or something like that, and there are 20,000 balls in the barrel. And you've drawn 19,000 balls out of the barrel, and they've all been red. And you assume on this basis, well, they all must be red. All the balls in the barrel must be red. That's a much stronger assumption than you can make if you've drawn 100 balls out of the barrel and they're all red. Okay, so the statistical accumulation response says, although we can't ever operate as though necessity is the case in the world, still we can increase our confidence in our matter-of-fact assertions on the basis of the number of statistical instances that we have of them. Let me read some passages from Hume here just to back this up. I'm reading from page 20. Okay, he writes here in part 2, near the beginning of part 2, at the bottom, towards the bottom of page 20. He says, when it is asked, what is the nature of all our reasonings concerning matter of fact, the proper answer seems to be that they are founded on the relation of cause and effect. When again it is asked, what is the foundation of all our reasonings and conclusions concerning that relation, it may be replied in one word, experience. Okay, but if we still carry on our sifting humor and ask, what is the foundation of all conclusions from experience, this implies a new question. There he is saying that experience is the key to understanding matters of fact. Okay, a little further on. Okay, he writes, this is on page 21, about 2/3 of the way down the page. Okay, it is this process of the mind or thought of which I would willingly know the foundation. This is a process of the mind or thought of which I would willingly know the foundation. It is allowed on all hands that there is no known connection between the sensible qualities and the secret powers, and consequently that the mind is not led to form such a conclusion concerning their constant and regular conjunction by anything which it knows of their nature. Okay, that's a complicated sentence, but I think it'll become clear in the next sentence. As to past experience, it can be allowed to give direct and certain information of those precise objects only, and that precise period of time which fell under its cognizance. But why this experience should be extended to future times and to other objects, which for all we know may be only in appearance similar, this is the main question. Okay, so there he says that human beings can use experience to make predications about the past, but they have no grounds for asserting the same about the future. At the top of page 22, let me read another sentence. This is a well-known, famous sentence. he says, these two propositions are far from being the same. Here's the first proposition. I have found that such an object has always been attended with such an effect. Okay, so that's the first proposition. In the past, such an object has always been attended with a certain effect. And here's the second proposition. I foresee in the future that other objects which are in appearance similar will be attended with similar effects. Okay, those are two very different assertions. One is an assertion about experience, and the other is an assertion about necessity. Again, two very different assertions. And for humans to take their experiences and to assume necessity is to commit a logical fallacy. Okay, and again, he makes the point one more time. Hume writes in a kind of a repetitive style, but it's kind of a pleasing 18th century style, very, very folksy in certain ways. This is on page 24, 1/3 of the way down the page. He writes, when a man says, I have found in all past instances such sensible qualities conjoined with such secret powers, and when he says, similar sensible qualities will always be conjoined with similar secret powers, okay, he is using two different propositions. That's what Hume is saying. I have found in the past it has always been the case, and then the second proposition, this phenomenon will always be like this. Those are two different kinds of propositions. Okay, let me pause for a minute, and then I'm going to turn to what Hume thinks is the real answer here in explaining why the mind makes these kinds of assumptions and how the mind operates in its navigation of the world. Are there any questions or comments on any of these issues with regard to the problem of induction? Everybody good? Okay, Hume's answer here is that the mind reasons the way it does out of habit. Habit is the explanation for everything for Hume. Okay, the reason why you think that the cue ball, when it strikes the 8 ball, will cause the 8 ball to move is because of habit. Because you've always seen that happen before. It's not because you know that there's a necessity there. You cannot see the necessity. There's no necessary thing there. It's always actually that in the past, whenever the cue ball has struck the 8 ball has moved. And that has created in your mind a kind of a habit of thought, which has led you to believe that cue balls striking 8 balls lead to 8 balls moving. Okay, or every time in the past when someone has let go of an object and that object has dropped, that has led you in your mind to form a habit of thought where you believe that now when objects are let go of, they drop to the ground. Again, it is just a habit of thought. And that's the source of all of our understanding of experience for Hume. It is habits of thought, not any awareness of necessity. So on page 28, for instance, then, he writes, this principle, this is at the top of the page, first paragraph, this principle is custom or habit. For wherever the repetition of any particular act or operation produces a propensity to renew the same act or operation, without being impelled by any reasoning or process of the understanding, we always say that this propensity is the effect of custom. By custom, he just means habit. Let me read another famous passage, very famous. Custom, then, is the great guide of human life. It is that principle alone which renders our experience useful to us and makes us expect for the future a similar train of events with those which have appeared in the past. Without the influence of custom, we would be entirely ignorant of every matter of fact, beyond what is immediately present to the memory and senses. Okay, so custom then is the reason why we think that cause and effect exists. This is a really frightening proposition. This is a stab right in the heart of the sciences. Because Hume is asserting that although we think that cause and effect are connected, it in fact is just in our minds. It's not something that we can ever prove is the case in the world outside of our minds. I've asked before in this class the question, are scientific principles true as such, or are they just true for us? Okay, are they true as such? That is, do they exist there in the world, independent of us? If some other species, some alien creature were to encounter the world, would he encounter a world that is run on the basis of laws of matter and motion that we use? Okay, or is Hume, in saying that we can never get outside our minds and experience the world directly without mental intermediaries, is Hume demonstrating that cause and effect relations are just human additions, mental additions to the natural stuff in the world? Okay, so that's the reason why this was seen as really dangerous thinking. Okay, questions or comments? Yes, Kendrick.
That certainly hit the nail on the coffin. When I was hearing about his thinking, I said, wait, that's exactly an attack on science.
Yeah, sure is.
Like, oh, now I see. That's why he's controversial. Because then it's like what we've all been learning in science, is it really true? Or is it just what we think is true? We can't really prove it. But our whole goal is to prove that it's, true.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. He's seen as very controversial because he's basically calling into question all of the assumptions that undergird the scientific project. It's all at stake here when he says that we can't ever actually know something to be a law for certain. All that we can say is that in history it has been the case, or in our past experience it has been the case. Now, I don't think, I want to finish the lecture with one quick qualification. I don't think Hume is going to go out there tomorrow and say, well, I don't know that certain laws of matter and motion hold for sure. I only know that they've happened in the past, so maybe they won't happen this time. So I'm going to step out onto Fondren Road as the car is speeding towards me. What do they do on Fondren these days? 55, right? They seem to go much faster than the speed limit when I'm out there. Okay, as the car is speeding towards me, and maybe this time is not going to hit me. Right? I don't think he's going to say that. Okay? The reason why is because Hume actually thinks that you can live your life successfully knowing that laws of matter and motion are not laws of necessity. Instead, they are just history summaries. You can live your life successfully because these are highly probable kinds of things. Okay, is the sun going to rise tomorrow? If you've had 10,000 instances in your life of the sun rising, that makes it highly probable that the sun will rise tomorrow. So you can say with great confidence, yes, it's very probable based on past experience that the sun will rise tomorrow. Even though you can't say for sure, of necessity, the sun will rise. Is that a hint?
Oh, yeah, would I be able to make a comment?
Yeah.
That type of thinking, in my view, of jumping to necessity, that's kind of what has kept us alive as humanity.
I know.
For example, like cavemen,
I know.
saying people, oh, that berry killed that person, maybe I shouldn't eat that. Without that type of thinking, I don't think we'd still be alive today.
I'm totally with you, man. It's only by virtue of taking our past experiences and assuming that the future is going to be like that humans have made any scientific progress or knowledge progress at all. We just, we don't have anything else than just assuming that the future is going to resemble the past. You're absolutely right. And I think Hume would agree. He thinks that we just need to stop thinking in terms of stuff necessarily happening and begin to think more in terms of stuff probably happening. So, again, he's not going to step out onto Fondren Road and think, well, it's not necessity that the car will strike me when it's moving toward me at 55. Rather, he would think, it's highly probable it will strike me. Because it's always done that before, struck whatever object it was moving toward at 55. So it's highly probable it will do so this time as well. again, it's a kind of a shift in thinking, but it frightened a lot of people, many of whom misunderstood him. I'm actually convinced by this. I find this to be very convincing. But many people misunderstood him and thought that he was trying to question science as such. He is questioning science, but he's doing so in a way that's trying to knock it down in stature and say, look, it's still providing us with, feasible, actionable knowledge. It's not just not certain knowledge, it's probabilistic knowledge based on history. Okay, last comment for the day, Kendra.
Oh, I also thought, when I thought, oh, this is controversial, I also thought, he's not exactly wrong too, because we as humans, there's so much we don't know of. We haven't explored all of our oceans.
Sure.
There's probably another world out there that we haven't even explored.
Sure.
So I also see his rationale with how, it's better to say highly probable because you'll never really know. I guess maybe it was what he was saying was lost in translation.
A lot of it was, yeah.
Blasphemy to the church as blasphemy to science.
Yeah, and I think that there was a lot of misunderstanding, and this is complicated stuff, and people misunderstood it, and they thought that he was saying a lot more than he was trying to say. But I'm actually convinced by this argument. It doesn't cause me to lose faith in science. It causes me to reconceive of science as being a probabilistic enterprise, for what it's worth. Okay, thank you all for your attention today. Please stay tuned for further instructions